Sheriff Amanda Hayes stood frozen, staring at the scene before her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took in the sight that would forever haunt her. Her husband, Richard Hayes, lay on the ground in a pool of blood. His body was lifeless, a grim testament to the violence that had just transpired. The revolver she held in her trembling hands was still warm, a grim reminder of what she had just done. 10 shots. 10 times she had pulled the trigger. She had aimed, fired, and watched as the man she once loved collapsed before her. The noise of the gunshots had filled the quiet Texas evening, echoing through the wide, empty space of their ranch. But there was more to it than just the violence of the moment. What had driven her to this? What had pushed a lawman, someone who had sworn to uphold justice, to commit such an act? Amanda's eyes slowly drifted to the other figure in the room, a figure that made her heart shatter even more than it already had. Their daughter, Lucy, stood by the door, her small face pale with fear. The girl's wide eyes locked onto Amanda's, a silent understanding passing between them. Lucy had seen everything. The sheriff's hand shook violently as she lowered the gun. The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. Richard had been caught in a way that no father, no husband, should ever be caught with their 10-year-old daughter. Amanda's world tilted on its axis. The woman who had always sworn to uphold justice, to protect the weak, to fight for right, now stood in a room filled with betrayal and horror. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She wasn't supposed to be here, holding a gun, standing over her dead husband. The sound of sirens in the distance started to fill the air, drawing closer. Amanda knew that soon, the whole town would know. The law was coming, but she had already broken it. And as much as she wanted to deny it, she knew she couldn't undo what had just happened. But how had it come to this? How had a woman, a mother, a sheriff, ended up taking her husband's life in cold blood? It all started with a simple routine. Every morning, Amanda Hayes would wake up at 5 a.m. and head out to the barn to feed the horses. She had done it for years, ever since she and Richard had moved to the sprawling ranch just outside of Amarillo, Texas. The ranch was quiet and peaceful, the kind of place where you could escape the noise of the world and live a simple life. Richard, her husband of 15 years, had always been a quiet man, reliable and protective. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. Amanda couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but the cracks had started to show. There were whispers, small things at first, just odd looks and strange behavior. Richard had become distant, more distant than ever before. He had taken to spending long hours in the garage, tinkering with machinery or just sitting in his truck, staring off into the distance. Amanda tried to ignore the warning signs. She told herself it was just stress from the ranch, the bills, and the pressures of raising a young child. She wanted to believe that things were fine, that she could fix it, that their marriage wasn't unraveling. But deep down, Amanda knew something wasn't right. The suspicion crept in slowly, like a shadow in the back of her mind. It wasn't until one late afternoon, when she was cleaning up in the kitchen, that she noticed something that made her blood run cold. She had gone into the living room to grab her phone when she saw it. Richard's jacket on the chair, open. Her eyes immediately scanned the pockets, and that's when she saw the crumpled piece of paper, a small, folded note. Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, but then reached for it. Unfolding the paper, Amanda read the words printed on it. It was a letter, but not just any letter. It was a letter from a lawyer. The name on the letterhead was unfamiliar, Tommy Henderson. There were details about a court case, about visitation rights, about a custody agreement. Amanda's mind raced. She couldn't make sense of it at first, but one line stood out among the rest. Lucy is to be picked up from school at 3 p.m. tomorrow. Her stomach dropped. What did this mean? Why would Richard be involved in a custody case involving their daughter? Amanda immediately thought of the worst. Could Richard be planning to take Lucy away from her? Was he planning to leave her? Was there someone else? As the evening wore on, Amanda found herself growing more and more anxious. She tried to talk to Richard when he came home, but he was distant, avoiding her gaze and offering only curt responses. The tension between them was palpable, and Amanda knew, deep down, that something was terribly wrong. The next few days passed in a blur. Amanda's mind swirled with thoughts of what she had seen and what it might mean. She decided to follow Richard one evening, just to see where he went when he left the house. The air was thick with unease as she followed his truck down the winding dirt roads outside of town. She trailed him for miles, until he pulled into a small motel just on the outskirts of Amarillo. Amanda's heart sank. She watched as Richard got out of the truck and walked into the motel lobby. He didn't even look back. That night, Amanda lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that her life was falling apart. Her instincts were screaming at her that something was horribly wrong. The following day, after a restless night, Amanda decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She had to know what Richard was hiding. Armed with a determination she had never felt before, Amanda drove to the motel herself. She didn't tell Richard where she was going. She didn't want him to know that she was getting closer to the truth. She parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she approached the motel, her boots crunching on the gravel. She slipped through a side door, careful not to make a sound. The hallway was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke. Amanda's pulse raced as she reached the door to the room Richard had rented. She stood there for a long moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She was terrified of what she might find, but she couldn't turn back now. With one quick motion, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. What she saw inside shattered her world. Richard was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to her. But it wasn't the sight of him that made Amanda's breath catch in her throat. It was the girl sitting next to him. Their daughter, Lucy. Amanda's stomach lurched. She froze, unable to move, unable to speak. And then Richard turned around. His face was a mask of guilt and fear. "Amanda," he said softly, his voice shaky. "I can explain." But Amanda didn't want to hear it. She couldn't hear it. The truth was already clear. The betrayal was written in their eyes. And that's when everything changed. Amanda couldn't breathe. Her heart thundered in her chest as she stared at Richard, her husband, the man she had spent the last 15 years of her life with. And there, next to him, was their daughter, Lucy, her sweet, innocent little girl. But she wasn't acting like herself. She wasn't smiling or playing, as she should be. Instead, Lucy sat stiffly on the bed, her small hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion, as if she didn't understand why her mother was standing there, frozen in the doorway. Richard's voice broke through the silence, soft but firm. "Amanda, I didn't want you to find out like this." The words hung in the air like a bad smell, and for a moment, Amanda couldn't make sense of them. Didn't want her to find out? Her legs felt weak, and she had to lean against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. She had to get away, to think, but her body wouldn't obey. "Richard, what's going on here?" Amanda's voice barely rose above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or trying to make sense of what her eyes had already told her. The picture was clear, but the shock was too much to process. Richard stood up slowly, his face twisted in a grimace of regret, and stepped toward Amanda. But she held her hand out to stop him, her body stiffening in instinctual defense. She wasn't sure if it was the gun in her purse or just the anger rising inside her, but the thought of him touching her made her sick. "No," Amanda said, shaking her head. Her hands were shaking now, too, and she could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. I need you to explain this. Now." Richard looked at Lucy, then back at Amanda. His eyes were full of guilt, but there was also something else in them, something darker. He wasn't sorry in the way Amanda expected him to be. This wasn't about regret over a moment of weakness. This was something much worse. "I never wanted it to go this far, Amanda," Richard began. He wiped a hand across his forehead, clearly struggling to find the right words. It's not what you think." Amanda's mind screamed for him to stop talking, to stop trying to explain it. There was no explanation for this, nothing that could make it okay. Her eyes flickered to Lucy again, and she saw the small girl shrink into the bed, pulling the covers tightly around herself as if she could disappear. Her heart broke for Lucy, who had been caught in the middle of something monstrous, something she couldn't even comprehend. Amanda wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything but stand there, but she forced herself to stay still, to listen, to get the truth. The full, horrifying truth. Richard took a deep breath. It started when you were working those long hours, after I started helping with the ranch full-time. I didn't know how to talk to you about it. And then, one day, Lucy, he paused, his voice faltering as if the next words were too painful to say. She was going through some stuff, some emotional stuff. And he broke off, swallowing hard. I didn't know what to do, Amanda. I thought I was helping her. Things just went too far. Amanda felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, tilting. The air around her seemed to press in, suffocating her. The world spun as Richard's words took root in her mind, each one more impossible than the last. What was he saying? What was he trying to justify? I'm so sorry, Richard continued, stepping closer to Amanda, his voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to happen. It's just, I don't know what came over me. I never meant to hurt her or you. He was crying now, his face wet with tears. Amanda didn't know if she was still hearing the words or if they were just echoing in her head. Her mind kept circling back to one thing. Lucy, her baby girl. How could he have done this? How could he have taken something so sacred, so precious, and destroyed it? Amanda's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Richard. No, Richard, she whispered, the words coming out like a curse. You don't get to explain this. There is no explanation. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Amanda raised her hand again, silencing him. She wasn't sure if she could hear another word from him without losing herself completely. Richard began again, but Amanda had already turned away from him, her eyes locking onto Lucy. The girl's face was pale, tears streaking her cheeks, but she wasn't crying. She was just sitting there, frozen in a state of shock. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. She had to do something. She had to get Lucy out of this house, away from this nightmare. She stepped towards her daughter. Lucy, Amanda called softly, her voice thick with emotion. Come on, baby. We're leaving. We're going home. Lucy didn't move. She just stared at Amanda, her big brown eyes full of confusion, as if she didn't understand what was happening. Amanda knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Lucy, please, Amanda whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't know how to fix this. She didn't know what to say to make it better. But before Amanda could say another word, Lucy spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom, I'm scared. Amanda's heart shattered. She pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly, as if her embrace could erase the horror of the last few minutes. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Amanda had no idea how long she had been standing there, or how much longer she had before the law arrived. But she knew one thing for sure. Richard was going to pay for what he had done, and Amanda would make sure of it. The sirens grew louder. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Amanda knew she had no time left. The decision she had made was final, irreversible. As a sheriff, she knew the law, and she knew what this meant for her career, for her future, for everything she had worked for. But none of that mattered anymore. Lucy, still clinging to her, was whispering now, her words almost inaudible. Mom, why did he hurt me? Amanda felt the blood drain from her face. She had been too focused on Richard's betrayal, too wrapped up in her own anger and disbelief, to even begin to understand what Lucy had been through. The weight of the truth slammed into her like a freight train. Her mind was racing now, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Richard hadn't just hurt her, he had hurt their daughter. He had scarred Lucy in ways that Amanda would never be able to repair. But she could try. She could protect Lucy now. She had to. The sirens were nearly at the ranch. But Amanda couldn't wait for the law. Not anymore. As she glanced back at Richard, still standing near the bed, his face pale and haunted, she knew what she had to do. She would make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. And she would start by keeping Lucy safe. The doorbell rang. It was too late for any of that. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, urgent. The sound sliced through the air like a sharp knife, cutting into Amanda's fragile composure. The sheriff in her, trained, disciplined, always in control, felt like a distant memory. She looked down at Lucy, still trembling in her arms, and felt the weight of the moment settle in her bones. She had to act quickly. The law was closing in, and Richard knew it too. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to Amanda. His mouth opened as if he wanted to say something, plead with her, beg her to understand, to stop what she had done. But there was nothing left to say. Amanda, Richard began, his voice raw, strained. But she didn't let him finish. Stay away from me, Richard, she snapped, her voice colder than she intended. She hadn't meant to sound like that, but it was all she could do to stop herself from shattering. She needed to protect Lucy. The anger was still there, boiling inside her, but it was almost secondary now. She knew what she had to do next. The sirens grew louder, a constant reminder that the law was almost at her doorstep. But for Amanda, the truth was simple. This was no longer a situation where the law could offer her protection. It was too personal, too close. "Mom, I'm scared," Lucy whispered again, her small hands gripping Amanda's jacket. Amanda's chest tightened. She looked down at her daughter, at the wide, frightened eyes staring up at her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the horror Richard had brought into their lives. "Shh, sweetie, we're going to be okay. We're going to leave this place. We'll go far away. But we need to be quick, all right?" Amanda's voice softened as she spoke, trying to comfort her daughter even though she felt like everything was falling apart. Lucy nodded, her face still pale but trusting. Amanda didn't know if she believed the words herself, but she had to say them. She had to believe them for Lucy. Turning toward the door, Amanda tried to steady her breathing. She couldn't let herself fall apart now. The sirens were so close that she could almost hear the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. The law was coming for her, but they weren't going to catch her here. Not like this. "Richard," she said coldly, her voice shaking with the weight of everything she was about to do. "I'm taking Lucy, and we're leaving. Don't even think about stopping us." Richard stood in the middle of the room, staring at her with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. His face was a twisted mask of regret, but it wasn't enough. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His words were too little, too late. "Amanda, please," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "I know I've made mistakes, but—" "Don't you dare talk to me about mistakes," Amanda snapped, cutting him off. "What you've done to Lucy, to us, there's no excuse for that." Her hand tightened around the gun in her purse, the cold steel reminding her that she was the one in control now. She had to stay calm, had to focus. She grabbed Lucy's hand, guiding her out of the room, her heart pounding in her ears. But before she could reach the door, Richard spoke again. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry, Amanda. I never meant for it to happen. Please, you can't leave me." Amanda hesitated for a moment, her heart warring with the desperate man in front of her. For a second, she almost believed him, almost let herself feel sorry for him. But then she looked at Lucy's pale, terrified face, and all the compassion drained away. Amanda couldn't afford to feel sorry for him. Not now. Not after what he had done. With a single, final glance at Richard, Amanda yanked the door open and pushed Lucy out into the cold night air. "Come on, baby. Let's go. We need to hurry." But as they stepped outside, the harsh reality of the situation hit Amanda like a punch to the gut. The driveway was filled with flashing lights. The local sheriff's department had arrived, and they weren't here for Richard. Not yet. Amanda froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. The officers who had once been her colleagues, the people she had worked with, the ones she had sworn to protect. Now they were standing between her and the life she was trying to escape. They saw her. They saw her and Lucy. And in that instant, Amanda knew there was no turning back. "Sheriff Hayes," a voice called out from the headlights of a patrol car. It was Deputy Mike Calloway, a man she had known for years. His face was grim, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Amanda," he said again, his voice filled with confusion and concern. "What's going on? Where's Richard?" Amanda's mind raced, her body frozen with the weight of the decision she had already made. She could hear the other officers moving in, circling her, their eyes already narrowing in suspicion. But there was no time. No time for explanations. Her hand shook, but she kept her grip on Lucy, pulling her protectively to her side. "Mike," Amanda said, her voice low but steady, "you need to stay out of this. Please. I'm not going back in there." Mike stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, Amanda? What's going on with you and Richard? Where's he?" "Amanda." Richard's voice suddenly boomed from the door. He had come outside, his shirt soaked in sweat and blood. His face was wild with panic, but there was still that spark of something dark. He was watching her, watching them, with an expression Amanda couldn't quite read. She felt her pulse quicken, and for the first time, she realized just how far she had gone. She wasn't just running from Richard now. She was running from the law. She was a fugitive, and it was her fault. Her own choices had put her here, and now there was no easy way out. "Amanda, what happened?" Mike asked again, his eyes flicking to Richard, then back to her. His confusion had turned to suspicion. She had no choice now. The truth was too ugly, too raw to be spoken in front of the men and women who had once been her friends. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't understand. Before she could speak, before she could make her case, the situation exploded. Richard, eyes wild with panic, lunged forward as if to reach her. But before he could take a step, another officer shouted, "Freeze! Drop your weapon." It wasn't her weapon they were talking about. Richard had grabbed a gun from somewhere. The gleam of it caught the light of the patrol car. He was making a run for it, and the officers were all on edge. "Amanda!" Mike yelled as Richard made a move toward the barn. And in that split second, everything went dark. The sound of gunshots rang out through the night. The first shot echoed in the night, sharp and sudden. A jagged sound that split the air and made Amanda's heart stop in her chest. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The officers were shouting, scrambling. But Amanda could only hear the pounding of her own heart. The world around her had become a blur of flashing lights, frantic movements, and the burning realization that everything she had feared, everything she had tried to prevent, was now happening. Richard had made his move. The gunshot rang again, a desperate sound that sent shivers down Amanda's spine. She saw him, Richard, her husband, the man who had once been her partner, her family, now a stranger, running for the barn, his gun raised. He wasn't just running away. He was running toward something, toward a fight, toward his final chance to make things right, or make them worse. "Amanda, get down!" Mike Calloway shouted as he dove for cover behind a patrol car. The other officers scrambled to do the same, their weapons drawn, their eyes wide with terror. Amanda's legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to stay standing, her eyes locked on Lucy, who was trembling beside her, too frightened to even make a sound. The air was thick with tension as Richard's movements grew more erratic. His gun was now pointed at the ground, but Amanda knew better than to think he was finished. There was a look in his eyes, something primal, something broken. She couldn't afford to hesitate. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "Richard," Amanda shouted, her voice trembling but fierce, "put the gun down. You don't have to do this." But Richard didn't respond. Instead, he stumbled forward, his breath ragged, his finger tightening on the trigger. Another shot rang out, louder this time, more reckless. The bullet screamed past Amanda's ear, making her flinch, but she didn't flinch away. She couldn't afford to. She didn't even realize she had moved until she was crouched down, pulling Lucy behind a nearby patrol car. The girl was sobbing softly, her face buried in Amanda's coat. The world had gone insane. Amanda's hands were trembling as she pressed Lucy closer to her chest, trying to shield her from the chaos that was unfolding just feet away. There was a burning pit in her stomach, a sickening sense of dread that she couldn't shake. She had to keep Lucy safe, and she had to do it now. Through the chaos, she saw Mike Calloway, still crouched behind a patrol car, his gun raised, his voice calm as he tried to reason with Richard. "Richard, stop. You're only making it worse. Put the gun down and we can talk about this." But Richard wasn't listening. He was beyond reasoning, beyond anything Amanda could understand. His voice, when he finally spoke, was loud and cracked, desperate. "You don't get it. None of you understand. She's mine. She's my daughter. The words hit Amanda like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that made her gasp. Her eyes locked onto Richard, still standing in the middle of the gravel driveway, the barrel of his gun wavering between the officers and herself. His face twisted with anguish, the confusion of someone who had lost control of everything. Amanda didn't know what was worse: the fact that Richard had hurt their daughter, or the way he was trying to justify it now, even as he faced the consequences. "Amanda!" Mike shouted again, his voice tinged with panic as he looked back at her. "Get Lucy and get to the car. We'll handle this. You have to go now." The order snapped Amanda out of her daze. Mike was right. She couldn't stand here, frozen in place, not anymore. She had to get Lucy to safety, but as she reached down to lift her daughter, she heard another gunshot. This time, the shot wasn't a warning. It wasn't a stray bullet. Richard had fired again. This time, it was aimed directly at Mike. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Amanda's stomach dropped as she watched Mike's body jerk backward, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He didn't fall immediately. Instead, he staggered for a moment, his hand gripping the car door for balance. "Mike!" Amanda cried out, her voice high with panic. But she knew it was too late. He was already crumpling to the ground, blood pooling beneath him in an awful, expanding circle. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. But then, all at once, the officers surged forward, their guns drawn, their voices shouting orders. They moved as a unit, their instincts kicking in despite the fear and confusion that had paralyzed them all. Richard was running again, his legs pumping desperately as he headed toward the barn. But Amanda was no longer focused on him. Her eyes were fixed on Mike, lying motionless in the dirt. She could hear the frantic shouts of the other officers, but they felt distant. Nothing mattered except Lucy. "Come on, baby," she whispered, pulling Lucy up into her arms, cradling her like a precious, fragile thing. The girl was still trembling, too scared to even cry. Amanda had no idea where they would go, or how they would get there, but she knew one thing for sure. If they stayed, they would all die here. If she stayed here, Richard would kill someone else. The next few moments passed in a blur. Officers were shouting, their voices lost in the chaos. Richard's voice echoed from the barn, now muffled by the thick walls. But Amanda couldn't afford to listen. She had to go. "Get down! Get down!" Someone screamed as more gunfire rang out, but Amanda didn't stop. She kept running, clutching Lucy's small body against her, her heart thumping painfully in her chest. They reached her car. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the door open, but somehow, she managed. She shoved Lucy into the passenger seat, slammed the door shut, and scrambled behind the wheel. As she turned the key, the engine roared to life, and she slammed her foot on the accelerator, her mind numb with panic. The car lurched forward, the gravel under the tires flying in every direction as she sped away from the ranch, away from the wreckage of her life. Behind her, the lights of the patrol cars flickered in the rearview mirror, but she didn't stop to look. She couldn't. She couldn't afford to stop now. As the familiar roads of Amarillo blurred by, Amanda's thoughts raced. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know where they would go, or how they would survive. But one thing was clear: Richard had crossed a line, and Amanda would never let him hurt her, or Lucy, again. The silence in the car was deafening. Lucy's quiet sobs filled the space, but Amanda couldn't comfort her. Not yet. Not until she figured out what came next. But all she could do now was drive, and hope that, somehow, they would make it out alive. The wind whipped through the cracks in the car windows, and the low hum of the engine was the only sound that filled the air as Amanda sped down the empty highway. Lucy's sobs had quieted, but Amanda could feel the weight of her daughter's fear pressing down on her, a silent force that seemed to fill the car. Amanda's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She couldn't stop shaking. She couldn't stop thinking about Mike, about the way his body had crumpled in the dirt, the blood that had stained the gravel beneath him, the officers. The whole damn situation had escalated so quickly, so violently. Richard had never been the man she thought he was. Even after everything that had happened, She hadn't seen him as dangerous. Not like this. But the truth was too hard to ignore now. The monster was real, and he wasn't just someone else. He was her husband. Amanda's thoughts churned, but they kept circling back to Lucy, her daughter, so small and fragile, now caught up in the nightmare of their lives. Amanda had always protected her, always kept her safe. But now, what could she do? The law was no longer on her side. She was a fugitive, running from the very people she had once worked beside, the ones who used to trust her. "Mom," Lucy said softly, breaking the silence. Amanda's breath caught, and she glanced at her daughter, her heart tightening in her chest. Lucy's face was pale, her hair matted against her forehead with sweat. Her eyes were red from crying, her lips trembling. Amanda's own heart cracked at the sight of her daughter's innocence lost in such a short amount of time. Are we safe now?" Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine's growl. Amanda fought back the tears that threatened to well up. She had to stay strong. She had to protect her. "We're okay, baby. We're going to be okay." The words felt hollow as they left her mouth, but she couldn't tell Lucy the truth. Not yet. Not while she still had no idea what would happen next. The truth was, they weren't okay. They weren't safe. Amanda had no plan. No place to go. She wasn't even sure where she was driving. Her mind had been so consumed with the need to escape, with the panic that had set in after Richard's gunfire, that she hadn't even stopped to think about what would happen after they left the ranch. Where would they hide? How could they survive without anyone finding them? Her gaze flickered to the rearview mirror, and she swallowed hard. The patrol cars were gone, their flashing lights fading in the distance. For now, they were alone on the road, but Amanda knew that wouldn't last. They would be looking for her, looking for them, soon enough. It wasn't like she had vanished from their lives without leaving a trail. Her badge, her name, all of it was still out there. Every officer on that scene knew who she was. Amanda took a deep breath and tried to clear her mind. She had to think. There had to be somewhere they could go to get away. As she drove further into the night, the landscape around them became more barren, stretching for miles with no signs of life, just the endless stretch of asphalt that seemed to stretch on forever. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road in front of them, but the uncertainty ahead loomed even larger. "Where are we going, Mom?" Lucy asked again, her voice filled with that quiet fear that Amanda couldn't seem to soothe. Amanda wanted to say something reassuring. She wanted to tell Lucy that they were going to be fine, that everything would be back to normal soon. But the truth was, Amanda didn't even know what normal was anymore. Richard had shattered that, just like he had shattered their family. There was no going back. "I don't know, Lucy," Amanda said finally, her voice thick with emotion, "but I'm going to keep you safe. I swear to you, I won't let anyone hurt you." Lucy's quiet sniffle was the only response, and Amanda focused on the road ahead. She couldn't afford to think about what was happening behind her. Not now. Not when her daughter needed her more than anything. The miles stretched on, endless and empty, and Amanda's mind raced with the constant questions of where to go, who to trust. She had friends, sure, people she had known for years. But who could she trust now? Who wouldn't turn her in? And then, like a crack of thunder, the answer hit her. A distant relative. An old friend from her days growing up in the small town of Lubbock. A family friend who had always been kind, reliable, a person who could offer a roof over their heads, at least for a little while. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Amanda turned the wheel, guiding the car onto an exit ramp that would take them to the nearest highway toward Lubbock. She hoped it was the right decision. She had no other choice. Lucy was quiet beside her, her tiny frame curled up in the passenger seat, her face hidden in her arms as she hugged her knees to her chest. Amanda's heart ached for her, but there was nothing she could do except keep driving. The road seemed to go on forever, winding through dark, desolate stretches of land that made Amanda feel even more isolated. The night was long, and her thoughts never stopped, swirling around in a whirlpool of fear, regret, and uncertainty. But just as Amanda thought the night couldn't get any darker, it did. Out of nowhere, the headlights of another vehicle appeared behind them. At first, Amanda thought it was just another car on the road. But as the seconds passed, The vehicle began to close the distance between them, creeping up behind her. Amanda's stomach churned, and her pulse quickened. No, 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 no. She couldn't afford to be followed. Not now. She glanced at the rearview mirror, and her breath hitched in her throat. The car wasn't just following her. It was gaining on her. She looked back at the road ahead, her grip on the wheel tightening. Lucy, sensing her mother's unease, turned toward her with wide eyes. "Mom? What's wrong?" Amanda didn't answer. She couldn't afford to explain. She had to focus. The other car was getting closer now, so close that Amanda could see the headlights in her side mirror, blinding her. Panic surged in her chest. Could it be another officer? Had they already found her? Was Richard behind them, too, coming to finish what he started? Amanda floored the accelerator, the car shooting forward with a jolt. The vehicle behind her sped up as well, matching her speed. What was happening? She glanced again at the mirror and saw the unmistakable shape of a police car. A sheriff's vehicle. Her stomach dropped. It was them. They had found her. And now there was no escape. Amanda's hands gripped the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, but it didn't matter. She couldn't outrun the law. She couldn't outrun the consequences of what she had done. But she could try. She had to. For Lucy. The sheriff's car behind them wasn't slowing down. It wasn't even giving Amanda a chance to catch her breath. The headlights were blinding, their glow like an ever-present spotlight that made every inch of road ahead seem like a trap. The darkness that had once felt comforting now pressed in around her, suffocating, as if the very night itself was closing in. "Amanda, what's happening?" Lucy's voice was small, barely above a whisper, but Amanda could hear the panic creeping in. Her daughter's fear only made Amanda's own terror grow. She didn't have time to explain. The car behind her wasn't just any sheriff's car. It was her sheriff's car. Deputy Mike Calloway's patrol car. The same deputy who had shouted at her earlier. The same one she had seen fall in the gravel, blood spilling from his body. The thought of him still lying there, motionless, made her stomach twist. She couldn't help him now. She couldn't even bring herself to turn back and look at what had become of him. What if the officers had already come after her? Had already been sent to chase her down, arrest her, bring her back to face the consequences of what she had done? But this wasn't just a police chase. This was personal. The sheriff's vehicle was gaining on them with frightening speed, closing the distance between them like a hunter stalking its prey. Amanda's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to think fast. She had to keep moving, keep her mind sharp. There was no stopping now. "Mom," Lucy whispered again, her voice trembling. "Please, what's happening?" "I don't know," Amanda said through gritted teeth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "But we're not stopping. We can't stop." The engine roared under her, the car accelerating into the night as she pushed the pedal further to the floor. The wind whipped against the sides of the car, but Amanda barely noticed. Her focus was laser-sharp, her eyes locked on the road ahead, but she could feel the sheriff's vehicle drawing closer. The flashing lights from the patrol car illuminated the horizon in intermittent bursts, making the road seem like it was bending, twisting, and threatening to swallow them whole. A desperate idea flickered in Amanda's mind. She wasn't going to outrun them on this road, not at the speed they were going. The highway stretched for miles, but there was no way she could keep up this pace for long. But there was something she could try, something she had done 100 times on these very roads, back when she was a sheriff, back when she knew how the system worked. Without thinking, she took a sharp turn off the highway, veering the car onto a dirt road that split off into the desolate land beyond. It was a gamble, a huge one, but it was the only chance she had to shake them. The wheels of the car bumped and skidded over the uneven dirt, the sound of gravel crunching beneath them deafening in the silence that followed. The sheriff's car followed, unwavering, its headlights flooding the path behind them. Amanda's hands were slick with sweat as she gripped the wheel, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror with every breath. "Stay down, Lucy," Amanda said quickly, her voice tight. "Stay down, baby, and don't move. I need you to be quiet." Lucy nodded, too scared to ask more questions. Amanda could see her in the mirror, her small face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was trying to understand, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But there was no time to explain it to her. Amanda could hear the sirens now, too, wailing behind them, louder as the patrol car gained ground. The sheriff wasn't just pursuing them. He was hunting them. The dirt road was bumpy, uneven, and Amanda had to fight the wheel with every turn. There was no GPS out here, no clear direction, just endless stretches of land and the narrow road that snaked through the dark, guiding her deeper into the heart of nowhere. And yet, the sheriff's car was still following. It wasn't giving up. For a brief moment, Amanda thought she had a chance. She thought maybe the thick brush up ahead could offer them some cover. She could take another turn, disappear into the night, and find a way to lose them. But as she rounded a sharp bend in the road, she saw something that made her heart freeze in her chest. Ahead of them, standing in the middle of the road, was a large truck, a red semi, its enormous shape blocking their only way out. Amanda's pulse spiked. There was no way to stop in time. She had two choices: slam on the brakes and risk flipping the car, or swerve. But swerving meant risking a crash into the truck or into the trees on the side of the road. "Hold on!" Amanda screamed as she yanked the wheel to the side, desperate to avoid the looming truck. The car fishtailed. Tires screeched, and for a brief moment, Amanda thought they were going to roll. Lucy screamed, her hands clutching the seat as Amanda fought with the wheel. The car swung wide, and Amanda saw the semi-truck in her peripheral vision. It was coming closer, so close she could almost feel the vibrations of its engine. Just as Amanda thought they were about to crash, the car jolted. The tires hit the gravel at a wild angle, and with one final violent spin, the car slid to a stop, the front end buried in the thick brush, the rear bumper just inches from the truck's wheels. Amanda's breath was coming in short, jagged bursts. Her heart thudded in her chest as she turned to look at Lucy. The little girl was clutching the seatbelt, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "We're okay," Amanda whispered, even though she wasn't sure herself. She had to say it. She had to make Lucy believe it. But before Amanda could even reach for the door handle, a voice rang out from behind them. "Step out of the car, Sheriff Hayes." The sheriff's car had finally stopped, too. The officer's silhouette was framed by the headlights as he stepped out of the car, the outline of his uniform sharp against the glare. Amanda didn't need to look to know who it was. It was Deputy Mike Calloway. But this time, he wasn't shouting from a distance. He wasn't pleading with her. He was aiming a gun. "Get out of the vehicle, Amanda," Mike called again, his voice steady but cold, a command she could hear even through the shaking of her own hands. Amanda's body tensed. She knew the law, knew that this moment, this exact moment, was what she had feared the most. The line had been crossed. There was no way out. No more hiding, no more running. The officers were no longer the people she had worked beside. Now, they were the ones who were going to take her down. She felt the weight of the gun in her own hands, the cold metal still in her purse. But the choice wasn't hers anymore. "Please, don't do this," Amanda whispered under her breath, but her voice was drowned out by the harsh sound of the gunshot that rang out from behind her. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the night like a thunderclap. Amanda froze, her heart skipping a beat. The world seemed to stand still for a moment, a single instant of deafening silence. The harsh crack of the gunfire rang in her ears, and she looked over at Lucy, whose face was pale and filled with confusion and fear. "Mom?" Lucy whispered, her voice shaking, but Amanda couldn't answer. Her thoughts were a blur, racing 1,000 miles a minute, trying to understand what had just happened. Was it aimed at her? Had they fired at the car? The gunshot had been so close. It had sounded like it came from the other side of the car. Amanda's heart slammed against her chest as she glanced out of the window. Mike Calloway was standing by his patrol car, still holding his gun, his stance rigid and commanding. He hadn't fired at them. No, he had fired into the air. But the sound of that shot seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. A warning. "Amanda," Mike shouted again, his voice deep and firm, but there was something different in it now. Something colder. "I said step out of the car." Amanda's hands trembled, her eyes darting between Lucy and the officer. The road around them was empty, dark, and desolate. The only sounds now were the hum of her car's engine and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Her body was frozen, caught in a moment of hesitation. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, the tension in her chest building like a storm. What now? What did she do? She glanced over at Lucy again, her stomach turning. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. She couldn't afford to fail her daughter. Lucy, Amanda's voice was tight, but she managed to speak. Get down, baby. Stay low. Stay out of sight. Lucy nodded, her face pale, her eyes wide. She crawled under the seat, trying to stay hidden, but Amanda could hear her soft whimpers. Amanda's heart broke, but she knew she couldn't let the girl see her fear. She had to keep it together. The deputy's voice rang out again, this time with an edge of finality. I won't ask again. Get out of the car, Amanda. His tone was sharp, insistent. No longer the man who had once trusted her, worked beside her. Now he was her enemy. Amanda's pulse raced. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The car was stuck, the wheels trapped in the brush, and the sheriff's car was too close. The only thing left to do was face them. She took a deep breath, her hands still shaking as she reached for the door. The moment her fingers wrapped around the handle, she heard it, a low, rumbling growl. She froze. The growl grew louder, closer. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. It wasn't a dog, not a wild animal. It was the unmistakable sound of a vehicle's engine, its roar vibrating through the air. Someone else was coming. Amanda's heart raced. The sheriff's car wasn't alone anymore. Before she could process what was happening, a set of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. A new car, a black SUV, barreled down the dirt road, its tires kicking up dirt behind it. Amanda's breath caught in her throat as the SUV slid to a stop just behind the sheriff's car, blocking off any chance of escape. The new car's doors flew open, and a group of men spilled out. They were tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing. No badges, no uniforms, just men who looked like they meant business. Mike Calloway's stance shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the newcomers. Amanda could see the tension in his shoulders, his hands still gripping the gun, but his posture more guarded now. One of the men from the SUV stepped forward. He was taller than the others, his face partially obscured by a thick beard and dark sunglasses, even though it was late at night. He was calm, too calm, as if the entire scene didn't faze him. He looked at Mike, then at Amanda. Is there a problem here, deputy? He asked, his voice smooth and unfazed. Mike Calloway didn't immediately respond, his eyes flicking back and forth between the man and Amanda. There was a brief, tense silence before he finally spoke. I'm handling it, Mike said, his voice tight, but there was a flicker of doubt in his tone. This is a matter for local law enforcement. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Is it? Because it looks like you've got a fugitive on your hands, deputy. He took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. And I'm thinking that's a federal matter now. Amanda's blood ran cold. Federal? Federal? Mike asked, his voice betraying a hint of disbelief. What the hell are you talking about? The man with the sunglasses chuckled softly, and in the dim light, Amanda could see his eyes narrowing, a glint of something dangerous flickering in them. You've been chasing the wrong person, deputy, he said, his voice suddenly low, menacing. You think this is about a domestic dispute? You think this is about her shooting her husband? He gestured toward Amanda, his finger pointing in her direction. It's much bigger than that. Amanda's heart skipped a beat. Bigger than that? Mike Calloway didn't say anything, his confusion and suspicion growing with each passing second. But before he could respond, the man continued. We don't have time for this, he said to his men. The girl's important. And Sheriff Hayes, too, for that matter. I'm not here to clean up after you, deputy. I'm here to finish what you started. Amanda's blood ran colder still. Finish what you started? What the hell was he talking about? Who were these people? Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The desperation in Richard's eyes earlier, the things he had said. The threat had always been bigger than just her and her daughter. Amanda had been caught in something far darker than she could have imagined. And the moment she had pulled that trigger on her husband, The chain of events had unraveled beyond her control. The men who had just arrived weren't here for her. Not just for her. They were after Lucy. The thought hit Amanda like a freight train. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out across her skin. "Lucy," Amanda whispered, her voice shaking with fear. But as she turned, she saw the small, fragile body of her daughter still curled under the seat, too scared to move. The new man with the sunglasses stepped closer to the car, his eyes locking onto Amanda's with chilling intensity. "I know you don't understand everything yet, Sheriff," he said, his voice too calm, too controlled. "But trust me, you don't have much time." Amanda's mind raced. She had to protect Lucy. She couldn't let them get her. She couldn't let them take her daughter. Before she could react, the man gave a sharp nod, and his men moved in, their footsteps heavy on the ground as they surrounded her car. "Get out of the car, Sheriff Hayes," the man said again, his voice low and cold, like the promise of a storm. "Now." The warning was clear. There would be no more negotiations. Amanda felt her stomach drop. She wasn't going to survive this, but she wasn't going to let them take her daughter either. Not without a fight. She had only one option, and it was time to act. Amanda's mind raced, her thoughts slamming into each other like a tornado. She knew there was no escaping now, not with the men closing in on her car, not with Lucy still hidden in the back. She could hear the men's footsteps drawing nearer, the crunch of gravel under heavy boots like the countdown of her doom. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She had only one chance, and it was slipping through her fingers like sand. The man with the sunglasses, a figure that had somehow become the symbol of everything dark and wrong in this moment, stepped closer to her car. His eyes locked on hers, cold and unwavering. There was no compassion in those eyes, no sympathy for what she had been through. He wasn't here to understand. He was here to take. "Get out of the car, Sheriff," he repeated, his tone more insistent now, the finality in his voice unmistakable. "We're not going to ask again." Amanda's heart was pounding, each beat screaming for her to do something, anything, before it was too late. "Lucy." That one word was all she needed to snap into action. "Lucy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay low. Stay hidden." There was no time to think, no time to plan her next move. The sheriff's men were almost at the car, and the first one had already started to walk toward the driver's side door. If she didn't act now, it would be over. Her fingers shook as she pulled the small, cold object from her purse, a .38 caliber revolver. Her heart ached as her hand wrapped around the cool metal. It was a weapon she had carried as a sheriff, as a protector of the law, but now it was the last piece of her own protection. Amanda's eyes locked with the man's for a brief moment. There was no turning back now. She pushed the door open quickly, so fast that it slammed into the side of the SUV, knocking the first man back a step. The gun was in her hand now, aimed at the ground, but her heart was pounding so loudly in her chest that she barely heard the man's voice as he shouted to his colleagues. "You, get back," he yelled, and the men behind him scattered, their hands going to their own weapons. But Amanda didn't hesitate. She wasn't going to let them take Lucy without a fight. She wasn't going to let them finish what Richard had started. She took one step back, keeping the gun at her side. "Stay the hell away from my daughter," she shouted, her voice louder than she expected, but the anger and fear and desperation all rolled together in that one command. The man with the sunglasses didn't move. He didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hands in mock surrender. "I don't want any trouble, Sheriff," he said, his voice almost too calm, too patient. "We're just here to make sure everything goes smoothly. You don't need to do anything drastic." Amanda's breath was shallow, her entire body rigid with tension. "You think I'm just going to let you take her? You think I'm just going to stand here and let you destroy everything?" Her voice cracked, but she pushed through it. She couldn't let them see her weakness, not now. "You've already done enough damage," the man said, his smile tight, his eyes cold. "We just need to clean up. It's simple." Amanda's pulse raced. She couldn't let them get to Lucy. She couldn't let them finish what they had come here for. But the way the men stood around her, eyes fixed on her every move, made it clear they weren't leaving without what they wanted. She had one shot. Suddenly, the SUV's engine revved, and the sound cut through the tension, a low growl that seemed to vibrate in the air. Amanda's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the men. It was their ride, their getaway. She had to stop it. She had to stop them from getting away. "Lucy," she whispered again, "I'm coming for you." Amanda's fingers tightened on the grip of the gun. She wasn't going to let her daughter be taken. Not now. Not ever. Without warning, she spun around, aimed the gun at the windshield of the SUV, and fired. The shot was deafening in the night air. It rang out like a warning, the crack of the bullet breaking the silence like a thunderclap. The men closest to her flinched, their hands instinctively jerking back toward their own weapons. But Amanda didn't wait. She bolted toward the SUV, her eyes fixed on the tires. The men shouted at her, a chorus of demands and threats, but she didn't hear them. She had to move. She had to get to Lucy. The gunfire had given her the chance she needed, a distraction. She reached the rear of the SUV and slammed her shoulder against the back door. The metal creaked as it buckled under her weight, but it didn't open. "Get in!" she shouted at Lucy, her voice hoarse from the tension, the fear. She could see her daughter's small figure still crouching beneath the seat. Lucy didn't move. "Lucy!" Amanda screamed again, her voice cracking as she reached into the back through the window. Finally, Lucy's hand shot out, grabbing her mother's, pulling herself out from beneath the seat. Amanda grabbed her wrist, yanking her out of the car and into her arms. Just as she did, a sharp crack sounded behind her, a bullet. It was too close. Amanda jerked backward, shielding Lucy with her body as the bullet whizzed past her, grazing the side of the car. One of the men had fired. "Get her. Now!" shouted the man with the sunglasses, his voice laced with fury. Amanda pulled Lucy into the SUV, slamming the door shut behind them. The engine roared to life as Amanda threw it into drive, her foot slamming on the pedal. The tires screeched against the gravel, sending rocks flying into the air. The SUV lurched forward, tearing away from the scene. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as she sped down the road, her hands shaking as they gripped the wheel. The headlights of the sheriff's car and the men's vehicles were still visible in the rearview mirror, but she couldn't think about that. She couldn't think about anything but getting Lucy out of there. They had to be far away, far from the men who were hunting them, from the people who had been trying to tear their lives apart. But as the SUV rumbled forward, Amanda felt a pang of dread settle deep in her gut. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep running. Not when the people chasing them knew exactly where they were headed. Amanda's hands shook as she turned the steering wheel, and the words that echoed in her mind rang louder than ever before. "We're not safe yet." The road ahead stretched into the darkness, the headlights cutting through the blackness like a knife. Amanda's breath was heavy, her chest rising and falling as her hands clutched the steering wheel. The weight of what had just happened, the gunshot, the men in the SUV, her desperate escape, pressed down on her like a vice. But there was no time to dwell on it. Not now. Not when they were still in danger. Behind them, the sound of the sheriff's car and the black SUV faded for a moment, but Amanda knew it was only temporary. They wouldn't be able to outrun them for long. "Mom, what's going on?" Lucy's voice, small and trembling, broke the silence. Who were those men? Why were they trying to take me? Amanda's heart cracked at the sound of her daughter's voice. How could she explain any of this to her? Lucy had already seen too much, heard too much. Amanda had tried to shield her, protect her from the horrors of the world, but now it felt like the world itself was collapsing around them. "I don't know, sweetie," Amanda said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know who they are, but I promise you, I won't let them hurt you. I won't let anyone take you." Lucy stayed quiet, her small body trembling in the seat beside her. Amanda could hear the soft hitching of her breath, the barely contained fear. She knew that Lucy didn't understand everything, not fully. But she also knew that the innocence of her daughter had been shattered forever in the past few days. Amanda's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. The headlights of the sheriff's car had grown dim, but they were still there, a constant threat in the distance. The black SUV was no longer in sight, but she couldn't relax. They were out there, somewhere. and she had no idea how far they were willing to go to finish what they'd started. Her pulse quickened as she turned onto a side road, a dark, isolated path that led deeper into the woods. The gravel crunched under the tires as she pushed the SUV faster, the trees on either side of the road seeming to close in on them. This was no longer just a chase. It was a fight for their lives. Amanda wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew she had to keep moving. She couldn't stop. Not yet. She reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she grabbed it from the center console. She couldn't risk using it to call for help. If those men were still watching, if they were tracking her somehow, it would be the last thing she did. But maybe there was someone who could help, someone who could offer a safe place. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb pausing over a name. Derek. Derek was her older brother, a former Army Ranger, and the only person she could think of who might have the skills to protect them now. He had always been the one to watch her back when they were growing up. He was tough, resourceful, and if anyone could help her disappear, it was him. She pressed the name and waited as the phone rang, the line buzzing in her ear. "Come on, Derek. Pick up, please," Amanda muttered under her breath. The phone rang 3 times before Derek's familiar voice came through, sounding groggy but sharp. "Amanda? What the hell's going on?" "It's late. I need help," Amanda said urgently, her voice shaking. "Derek, they're after us. They know where we are. I don't know who they are, but they're—" Whoa. Slow down," Derek interrupted, his voice steady now, his concern clear. "Start from the beginning. What's happening?" Amanda took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. She had to explain, but she had no idea how. How did she explain that her husband was dead, that she had shot him, that there were men who were willing to do anything to take her daughter? I shot Richard," she said, her voice cracking as she said the words out loud. "I shot him after I caught him with Lucy. I couldn't. He was hurting her, Derek." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Amanda's heart raced, wondering if she had said too much. Finally, Derek spoke, his voice calm but full of tension. "Okay, just listen to me. You did what you had to do, Amanda. But right now, the priority is getting you and Lucy safe. Where are you?" I don't know. I'm on some back road. I'm heading toward the old cabin. It's deep in the woods. I thought it might be the only place no one would find us." Derek didn't hesitate. "Good. Head straight there. I'm coming to you. But—" "No arguments," he cut in. "I'm coming. I'll get you out of this. Just keep driving, Amanda. Don't stop for anything." Amanda nodded even though she knew he couldn't see her. "Okay," she whispered. "We're heading there now. But, Derek, they're after us. They won't stop." "I know," he said softly. "But I will." The line clicked off, and Amanda put the phone back down on the console, her breath catching. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but there was a glimmer of hope now. Derek was coming. He would be able to help them. But that wasn't enough. Not yet. Amanda took a sharp turn, veering off the path onto a trail that would lead them to the cabin. The headlights barely illuminated the path ahead, the trees looming on both sides like dark giants. The feeling of being hunted, of being watched, was suffocating. The world was closing in on them, and the weight of everything she had done, everything she had lost, pressed on her chest. But she didn't have time to feel sorry for herself. There was no time to mourn. She had to protect Lucy. She had to make sure they were safe. Minutes passed, each one feeling like hours as the trees thickened around them. The trail was bumpy, uneven, and Amanda's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she navigated through the woods, her eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. The sound of the engine seemed so loud in the quiet night, the only noise aside from the wind whispering through the trees. Suddenly, ahead of her, she saw it. The old cabin. It was small, nestled deep in the woods, its silhouette barely visible in the dark. It was the kind of place that looked abandoned, isolated. It was the perfect place to hide, the perfect place to lay low for a while. She slowed the SUV as she approached the cabin, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was following. The headlights illuminated the rickety structure, the faded wood, the overgrown weeds. It was exactly as she remembered. She parked the SUV behind the cabin, out of view from the road. Lucy, Stay in the car, Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible as she turned to look at her daughter. Lucy didn't say anything, but her eyes were wide, filled with fear and uncertainty. Amanda swallowed hard and opened her door, stepping out into the cold night air. The sound of the wind rustling the trees above was the only noise as she moved toward the cabin. Every instinct told her to be cautious, to be silent, to make sure the coast was clear. She pushed open the door to the cabin, the wood creaking as it opened. Inside, it was just as she remembered. Dark, dusty, and empty. A place that felt like it hadn't been touched in years. She glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. No one was there, but in the distance, she thought she heard something. A car, coming closer, and the sound of voices. They were getting closer. Amanda's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't imagined it. The sound was real, coming from the road just beyond the trees. She could hear the faint hum of an engine, the distinct whine of tires on gravel. It was unmistakable. Her pulse quickened as she stepped inside the cabin, glancing around at the dim, musty interior. The place had been abandoned for years, just a small shack in the middle of nowhere, but it had served its purpose when she was younger, a place to hide, to think, to escape. She had never imagined she'd be running here like this, on the run for her life. Amanda's eyes darted back to the SUV, parked behind the cabin. She couldn't let them find it. She couldn't let them find Lucy. The wind was picking up now, the trees around her groaning and swaying, as if nature itself was trying to warn her. Amanda's hand shot to the door, slowly pulling it shut. She had to keep quiet, keep her movements silent. She couldn't afford to alert anyone to her presence. The voices were louder now, clearer. The men had arrived. Stay here, Amanda whispered to herself. Stay low. Stay quiet. But she couldn't do that. Not anymore. She had made too many mistakes, and she wasn't about to make another. She had to take control. She had to fight. Her hands were clammy, but she gripped the handle of the gun in her purse. It felt heavy in her hand, like a weight she didn't want to carry but had no choice but to hold. It was the only thing between her and those men. And right now, it was the only thing keeping Lucy safe. She took one last glance at the cabin, at the narrow window that was covered in dust and grime, barely letting any light through. She needed to get a better look, to figure out where the men were. How close were they? Were they already at the cabin? Or were they still circling the area, trying to figure out where she had gone? The faint glow of headlights cast eerie shadows against the trees. Amanda could see them now, two vehicles parked just beyond the tree line. One was the sheriff's car, unmistakable with its flashing lights. The other was the black SUV, the one that had chased them earlier. She crouched low, crawling toward the window, trying to stay out of sight. Her breath was shallow, her heart hammering in her chest as she peered through the cracked glass. She could see figures moving around, dark shapes against the illuminated glow of the vehicles. The men were getting out. They were close. Too close. Where is she? One of the men shouted, his voice sharp and cold. She can't be far. Find her. Amanda's stomach twisted. They were hunting her. Hunting Lucy. Another voice called out, deeper, with a strange familiarity in the way it sounded. She'll be here. She has nowhere else to go. You know that. It took a second for the words to register, but when they did, they hit Amanda like a punch to the gut. Mike, the deputy, the one she had once trusted. He had come with them. He was part of this. He was working with them. The realization sank deep into her bones, a chill creeping down her spine. She had known Mike for years. They had worked side by side in the sheriff's office. He had been a friend, a colleague, but now he was one of them. One of the men who were after her and Lucy. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't trust anyone anymore. Check the cabin, Mike's voice ordered again. She's here. She has to be. She wouldn't have gone far. Keep your eyes peeled. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest. She barely had time to react before the sounds of footsteps reached her ears. The crunch of boots on gravel. The rustling of leaves. They were getting closer. She had to move. She couldn't wait any longer. Amanda quickly turned, her pulse racing, her eyes frantic as she searched for an escape. There was only one way out of the cabin, through the back door. But she couldn't leave without Lucy. She couldn't let them take her daughter. Her mind worked quickly. If they were coming for her, they'd be expecting her to run. They would think she was cornered. But Amanda wasn't going down without a fight. She knew how to use the land, how to hide in the woods. She had done it before, and she would do it again. She turned toward the back door, her hand on the handle, ready to make a break for it. But as she pushed the door open, she froze. Standing in front of her, silhouetted in the doorway, was none other than Mike Calloway. His gun was drawn. His face, illuminated by the soft moonlight, was unreadable. There was no sign of the Mike she had known, the friendly, loyal deputy. Now, he was just another threat, another man who was part of this game. Amanda's heart sank. She had hoped she would never have to face him like this. But there he was, standing in front of her, blocking the only exit. "You don't have to do this, Mike," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear bubbling in her chest. "You don't have to follow them. This isn't you. This isn't what you signed up for." Mike didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked to the gun in Amanda's hand, then back to her face. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that looked like regret, but it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. He took a step forward, his gun unwavering. "I'm sorry, Amanda," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "But it's too late. I've already made my choice." The words hit Amanda like a physical blow. She had hoped, deep down, that there was still some part of Mike left, the part that remembered who she was, who they both were. But there was no saving him now. There was no turning back. "Please," Amanda said, her voice breaking, "don't do this. I'm not your enemy. These men, they're not who they say they are." "There." Mike raised his hand, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear it," he said, his voice growing colder. "It's done. There's nothing you can say that will change it." Amanda swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. The weight of the gun in her hand felt heavier than ever, but she knew she couldn't back down now. Not with Lucy out there. "Mike," she whispered, her voice almost pleading. "Please, they're using you. They don't care about you. You're just a pawn to them." Mike's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening. He took another step forward, his stance shifting. "I'm sorry, Amanda. This is how it has to end." Before she could react, he lunged at her. Amanda's training kicked in. Her instincts took over. With a speed born of years of law enforcement experience, she raised the gun and fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the silence of the cabin. Mike staggered back, his hand clutching his shoulder. His eyes widened in shock, but there was no time to process it. Amanda didn't wait. She ran, toward the backwoods, toward the dark, where the shadows would hide her. Toward Lucy. She didn't look back, and as she disappeared into the woods, she knew this wasn't over. Not yet.